Welcome to Capital H. I'm Kyle Forrest, and today we're diving into the evolving world of fractional leadership with focusing on fractional chief people officers. Our special guests, Tracie Sponenberg and Alex Seiler, will share their experiences and insights on what it takes to succeed in these roles, lessons learned, and how to position oneself for success as a fractional chief people officer. So, Tracie and Alex, thank you so much for joining. Tracie, let's start with yourself with just some introductions. And by the way, welcome to Capital H. Could you just share a little bit about your career journey, your background, and your experience as a fractional chief people officer?
Sure. Hi, Kyle. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I've been in the world of human resources for about 30 years. So I started my career with a giant Fortune 50 company and did the opposite thing of a lot of people and then went to small and mid-sized companies. So I've been leading HR for about 25 years. And a few years ago, I started to feel like maybe I wanted to do something different at some point. And so I started hearing more about fractional. So I hired a coach in case that was something I wanted to do sooner than later. And it turned out it was much sooner than later. So at the very beginning of 2024, I stepped out on my own as a fractional chief people officer, advisor, and a lot of other things.
Awesome. Thanks, Tracie. And we're going to come back to that coach point in a moment because I think that's an important thing for us to dig into. So, Alex, would love to hear a bit about your background as well and your journey to becoming a fractional chief people officer.
Sure. And again, similar to Tracie, very happy to be here, thankful to be here. I come from a very global background, first of all, so thus the interesting accent. So I was born and raised in Hong Kong, but my mother was British and my father is Swiss. And I've been in the US for 21 years, and 20 of those have been in the people and HR space, which I pretty much fell into. And the arc of my career has really been from going from big multinationals to small, mid-sized companies to now working with a lot of startups. And really, I'd always been in-house until the middle of 2023. And then I took a sabbatical for family, personal reasons. My mother unfortunately passed away at the end of 2023, and that led me to reevaluate exactly what I wanted in my career. And at that point, I'd always thought about having my own business, running my own business, and the idea of fractional was popping up in a lot of different places. So I really thought, why not give it a whirl? And it's been a real journey, and it's taught me a lot in the process. So I've been doing it for over a year now, and I learn something new every day.
Awesome. Well, and Alex, thank you also for being vulnerable and sharing part of what was the personal driver for you to reevaluate from a career perspective and lead you onto this journey. So let's actually dig in a little bit more with each of you, right? Because I think in 2025, 2024, you could go on various social media platforms and all of a sudden see, hey, fractional leader this, right? Almost like becoming a life coach, right? Everyone thinks they've got some experiences they can coach others. Like just because you've been an executive doesn't mean you can be a fractional executive. So Tracie, maybe let's start with you because you said you very specifically hired a coach. Like what did you do talking with the coach that led you to think fractional is right for me? And then here's the steps I'm going to take to become a fractional executive.
So I didn't actually know it was right for me. I just knew that I wanted to do something different and thought that would be a good path because it actually was very similar in a lot of ways. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But I thought that I could be a chief people officer at another company, a number of different companies just in a shorter amount of time. And that would feel a bit different. So I think that is a misconception. I think it can feel a bit different, but it can also feel like in my case, it did feel very much the same. And I think people get into fractional for a lot of different reasons. And one of them shouldn't be chasing something that you don't know what you were chasing, like I did. I got in for, I think, a very personal reasons. I wanted to leave and do something different. And I ended up loving it, but I'm doing it in exactly my own way now.
Yeah. And Tracie, actually part of what you shared makes me even think, if we take a step back for a moment for the audience and define what is a fractional chief people officer, right? Some folks might say, all right, I'm doing 10 hours a week in a chief people officer role. Someone else might be thinking, I'm 100% of my week, a full work week, but it's for 6 months, right? So I don't know if Alex or Tracie, what either one of you wants to kind of like define what fractional chief people officer means for you, and then what you're seeing kind of in the market relative to that.
Tracie, do you want to go first?
Yeah. I think of short term, like you mentioned, is more of an interim and something that we're really accustomed to, an interim executive in some sort of way. Things that are more project based or more consultants. And I think fractional chief people officers have been around for a really, really long time. It's just the name. And it just means, to me anyway, a fraction of the time. So instead of all of my time, the client would have a fraction of it.
I would just add to it, for me, it's also part of the learning is there's so many different ways that you can set up a fractional relationship as well. And the nature of the work can look very different. You know, there's some that involve a lot more what I would call blocking and tackling and getting in the weeds and operational work. And then there's others that are more purely advisory. So it's also all of these relationships or these agreements or engagements can look quite different. So there's not a one size fits all, it's a one size fits one. And sometimes a lot of the clients you talk to aren't even necessarily sure what they're looking for out the gate. And it's through conversation and discovery that you figure that out together.
Can you talk through, like, how do you go about in some of the fractional roles you've been in, really scoping the role and getting clarity on what does that look like for the percentage of your time and what the company is going to get from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's part of, and you've probably heard me say this before, Kyle, but like anything, there's pros and cons to fractional work, just like there is full-time work. It's just how you dig into it and what your preference is, really, at the end of the day. I'd say for me that the discovery piece is really important because it helps you understand what that engagement will look like. And, it might be right for you, but if it isn't, you can also refer out the business to other people, other individuals within the fractional community. Tracie and I are both part of something called Fractional People, which has a lot of people that share fractional opportunities that are out there because they might not be for them, but they would be for some other folks as well. One of the reasons I enjoy fractional is because you can really have a point of view, but not be on somebody's payroll, right? Is one thing I've said before. But, there are also things that you need to consider that you don't necessarily have to consider as a full-time employee, right? You're no longer necessarily a W-2 unless you set yourself up as an S Corp, right? And get paid by your company. So you have to think about the tax implications, which you didn't necessarily have to do before. And then there's a lot of administrative work that comes with it, right? Especially at the beginning, like, whether you putting together engagement letters, invoicing people, things of that nature. So you really need to really think about being a business owner, not just a fractional people leader.
So maybe a takeaway for folks listening to this who are full-time employed right now: get ready for a lot of work up front before you even pursue your first fractional role.
Exactly.
One of my mentors named Mike Marks. I work largely in distribution, and he's been in the distribution industry forever. And he says something that plan for 33% of your time, plan for a third of your time working on the administrative side of your business. And that is not wrong. Mm-hmm. That's really accurate.
Yep. I'll just add to that because Tracie and I, obviously, coming into this conversation, as you know, Carl, we know each other. And I think the benefit of finding your people as you go through this, because we started fractional at the same time, is also really important. And frankly, has built in efficiency for us because Tracie's done things that I haven't done and vice versa. And the ability to share that and not recreate the wheel is also really important if you want to save on some of that administrative time.
Yeah. So maybe takeaway number one was prepare for the administrative burden. Takeaway number two is find your community who can help you lessen that burden. And also, once you're in your first fractional role, you've got a network of people who can help you with lessons learned, right? To be an effective fractional executive.
And I would add to that, and don't be afraid to ask questions because you're in a new stage or area of your career that you haven't really tried before. So leave any potential ego at the door and be prepared to really just be exposed and vulnerable in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tracie, you shared, Fortune 50, right? To small, mid-size, and now into the fractional roles. What are some lessons learned or big differences people should expect? Part one of the question. Part two, what are some of the sizes of the companies you're seeing request fractional roles, right? Because I think that might be a nuance for people if they're like, hey, I'm an executive in this business of this size, I'm going to jump into fractional, and it might just be a very different size and scale of a company than they're used to, which has a lot of nuances and learning to come along as well.
Yeah, so that was something that was interesting to me because I worked mostly in mid-sized companies, so up to 1,000-ish people. And Fractional chief people officers tend, not exclusively, but tend to work in startups and smaller businesses, maybe that can't afford a chief people officer or aren't ready. And what I did was try to do something a little bit different and go into a space that had no idea what it was. And so what I ended up doing, and this is a big lesson learned for me, so I ended up taking an opportunity to help someone hire a head of HR and turn that into a fractional role. But what I did was underestimate the amount of education I'd need to do to that organization in understanding what a fractional person did. And that is something that I think in maybe in the startup world, maybe, Alice could speak more to that. There's more knowledge there. But if an organization or a particular industry isn't used to hiring fractional executives, there's a significant amount of time talking about what you do, how you do it, the hours that you work, when you're available. I remember my first client, it was, it's 10 o'clock, you're here. I'm like, yeah, I'm 25 hours a week, right? And so that is really, really, really important.
Alex, anything you'd build on from there?
Tracie, as she mentioned, we play in different spaces. And, part of my first role came actually as a result of one of the startups that I advised. So I advised 4 startups in the HR tech space. And one of them, reached out to me. And like a lot of founders, when they trust you, right? So they were like, we're starting to scale. We could really use your help as a fractional CPO as well. One of the things that I've learned though is, and I know it's with startups, the thing is burn is so key and they don't necessarily have the money or the headcount yet to bring on somebody full time, but they also recognize that they need to build the infrastructure and the underpinnings to be successful as they scale and as they go through rounds of funding as well. So that's where fractional chief people officers become, or fractional leaders become so important for tech companies, because they're preparing for whatever is the next evolution or the next series of their company as well. So I think that's what I've learned, and why I do think, to Tracie's point, probably a little bit more knowledgeable, because a number of people have worked already, who've come from these startups, have worked in tech already, and have come to be used to what that looks like.
Okay. And Alex, maybe if I actually take that a little bit, so you're going through a funding round, your company's growing, there's probably at least someone, maybe a small team, doing people-related things, whether that's recruiting or payroll or benefits, right? Maybe some of the blocking and tackling. And then you come in as a fractional chief people officer, and all of a sudden it's this new person in a part-time executive role for this team who maybe they reported to the CFO or directly to the founder, right? Share a little bit about how do you go engaging the team and helping them understand your role to help them potentially grow and scale in their own function, right? Because some people might say, well, you're not 100%. Like, how do I know you're as fully dedicated to this, especially in a startup environment, as I am?
That's my ideal setup, what you just described for my end. Might not be for the rest of the team.
Yeah, it's like here, there's nobody, and now I'm part-time.
Exactly. I mean, Tracie and I have discussed this in the past. I mean, the way I would preface that, especially in what you described, is you don't need, first of all, 40 hours of me in a situation like what you just described. You probably need maybe 10 hours of me a week, and maybe more in an advisory capacity. Because what I've tended to find the biggest challenges in those situations is things like decision making and things like developing a people strategy. So in that situation that you described, the way I would sell it into both founders and to members of a people team that may have been reporting to founders is, I'm not here to block you. I'm here to add and build in capabilities that might not exist right now to round you out even more and to help you get to your next stage of funding.
Got it. Okay. Tracie, I'll kind of acknowledge the nuance, right? From startup companies, maybe a specific type of industry. For you, what would be kind of your equivalent? Like, how are you building trust with the team, if there is a team there to begin with?
Yeah, and this is a great time to talk about what I am doing, which is a little bit different. So one of the things that definitely different than what I started, one of the things that I love about fractional people is it embraces the whole community and it expands the definition of fractional beyond what I thought of it when I first started, which was I go in as a chief people officer for a fraction of my time. So what I did, and this is one of the, I think, most important things for people listening to remember who might be considering going in the fractional area is it doesn't have to look like you think it might look like, right? What it does is it starts with a conversation with a business about their business needs and about how you can fill those needs. And what I ended up doing through having those conversations was finding myself more in an advisory role. And also from having an experience with a company that I was a fractional chief people officer, and they weren't ready for me. They weren't ready for somebody who actually was very strategic. They were ready for just a little bit of that. They weren't ready for somebody to really transform. The CEO was ready. The rest of the team wasn't ready. And so I love the distribution, manufacturing, industrial industries and mid-sized plus companies. So I had a chance to really reinvent what I was looking for. And what I did was find myself more in an advisory capacity and working with companies that don't have chief people officers, but they have somebody leading HR and leading a team. And I am, like Alex talked about, the blocking and tackling. I realize I don't want to do that anymore, at least right now, right? And so I'm helping these individuals, I'm advising them to step into their role in a more strategic way, to offer more to their business, to, embrace the humanity within people and to learn and upskill modern HR practices, which our industry isn't necessarily known for. So I still am fractional. I still consider myself fractional, but I found my own way of doing things, which is, I think, really cool. And I think that's something that people listening really need to hear because it doesn't have to look one way.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that, Kyle, Tracie and I have both said this about ourselves in the past, is we're business leaders who happen to have a specialization in people. And I think through our learnings, we've actually cultivated our business to be more than just fractional right now. It's actually very similar. We've got about 3 or 4 different lines of business, which essentially are different forms of revenue. So we're really looking at all of our offerings as part of our business, right? And it goes beyond fractional. There's advisory, there's brand partnerships, there's speaking. So there's different components to it. So I think the other thing, just building off what Tracie said, is there's a lot more diversity than people might think and optionality out there as well. And the one thing I would also add that we haven't really talked about yet in this conversation is people need to remember that you are the brand now, right? Yep. You are not representing a company anymore. The company was your brand in the past. You are now the brand, and you need to get comfortable getting yourself out there, whether it's to do active business development if referral work is not coming in or you're not getting much inbound, or just to be out there so that people know what you're doing. Otherwise, you become out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, a couple of things that I'm taking away from what you and Tracie just shared. Number one, to your point on you are the brand, fractional chief people officer probably is not in and of itself the revenue stream, right? So what are those other revenue streams depending on where you live, the lifestyle you want to afford, family situation, you name it, right? Whether that's podcasting, public speaking, advising on other things, or multiple fractional roles at a time, right? So I think that was one. The second, you both referenced focusing on the business, right? Alex, you said business leader who focuses on people, right? Tracie, you said being clearly aligned on the business outcomes that a company's trying to drive with you as a fractional people leader and advising, heads of HR, right? And helping them develop. And I think that was even kind of like my third takeaway, right? Is sometimes heads of HR at companies who aren't in chief people officer or CHRO roles or whatever it may be, they have the potential to become, but they do need a little bit of extra help, right? And instead of hiring an executive coach, maybe having a fractional chief people officer who can show the way is kind of a new way to help invest in the development of your next kind of level of talent.
Yeah.
With one of my clients, that's how I started. I hadn't, and Alex helped me with this because I hadn't done this. I started coaching and it was very clear that what she needed was an advisor and a partner and not so much a coach. And I think the other thing I wanted to speak to what you said was the business part. And I'm probably, I hate to admit this, but I'm probably better at business than at people sometimes.
Same.
Yeah. And so it's the more you move up in your career and the more your role looks like the business and less like core HR. And I think that's something that's sometimes a shock for people who step out of into this world. So that was, something I've been doing for a very long time, but that's surprising sometimes to clients.
And Kyle, the thing I was just going to add to what you were saying before about the benefit of bringing on a fractional chief people officer to help in that way is you also could take it a step further and think about how it could benefit the C-suite as a whole, particularly depending on where people actually report, right? Because a lot of the time it can be the CEO, but depending on whether they're very product or client focused, it can be a COO who typically oversees people. And if they only have a director of people reporting into them, having a fractional chief people officer is going to be super helpful to them, right? As a sounding board, as a way of learning, of things like that. So there's different ways that you can cut it recently where it can be beneficial.
Yeah, I love that. So I know we're coming up on time. Maybe Alex, I'll start with you and then go to Tracie. Like if you had to tell people just one thing to take away or one thing to consider before they get started on this journey, what would you say?
I would say talk to people who are already fractional leaders and help ask for the unvarnished truth. What are the pros? What are the cons? Really do virtual coffee chats, do whatever you can do to soak things up so that you don't come into it sort of maybe blindsided with this sexiness or romanticized view that we were talking about. There's really great parts to fractional leadership, but there are also things that you need to consider that maybe you don't like. So you need to make sure that you're making the right decision for you, not somebody else. Yeah, love it. Tracie, what about yourself?
And I would +1 to that. And I would also add talking to people if you're specializing in an industry, which I actually think is a great idea. I know someone who actually specializes in the tattoo industry, which is very niche. Talk to business leaders and what do they need? And what's a gap in the market that you can fill? If you're specializing in X and X is missing in that particular area, I think that's a really great way to focus and a great way to get clients. And then, share with people, once you decide to do it, share with people that you know. All of my business and all of my potential business, all of it comes from not necessarily people I know, but people who I know who know people. So it's that second connection. And that's just me being out there and talking about it. I have a call with somebody I went to college with, and this isn't dating myself, but 30 years ago, I get a cold email. Hey, you might not remember me, but I have a client that I've been following you on LinkedIn, and I have a client that knows that might need what you do and have no idea if this is going to go anywhere. But isn't that cool, right? So those sorts of things. So just by talking about it, having those conversations, and then keep having them, and people will remember that. Yeah, love it. Well, I want to thank you both for joining in this incredibly insightful discussion. To Capital H listeners, here's a couple takeaways. 1, prepare for some administrative burden. 2, lean into the network of other fractional people officers to help reduce the burden, but also to give you the unvarnished truth before you jump into it. 3, talk to the business executives and get very clear on what are the business outcomes and problems you're trying to solve and how are you going to be most beneficial as an advisor. And number 4, you are the brand now, right? You need to think about your revenue streams beyond just this. How does your book of business come in? What are the referrals? What are you specializing in? And know that there's this fractional people network out there who can help you with all of those things. So don't go it alone. Tracie, Alex, thank you both so much for joining us on Capital H. Truly appreciate you sharing your time and your stories. And I hope that this is truly beneficial to the folks out there. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Well, that's it for another episode of Capital H. For more insights and episodes, make sure to tune in and we will see you next time.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.